Let each thing you would do, say, or intend be like that of a dying person. Marcus Aurelius. Must be time for another episode. Hello, Full Metal family, and welcome back to another episode of the Full Metal Cast. I am your host, Morris Walker, and because I still have the same number of listeners as I do friends, today will be yet another solo episode comprising of me monologuing about a more serious topic, and then chasing it down with a fun palate cleansing topic. If there are any guests, though, that you would want to see me interview or just shoot the shit with, let me know. By now, you probably have an idea of what I'm into and what I like to ramble on about in these episodes. But as I mentioned in the first episode, having fun in this life is critical. So if there's someone that would just be a fun person to chat with, please do it. DM me, or shoot me an email, and I will do my best to try to get them on the show and to make that happen. I also am kicking around the idea of doing some short episodes on a Friday or the weekend, just going over, bourbon, cigars, guns, cars, motorcycles, etc. Just some fun, little short things, just to sort of break up some of the seriousness of each episode here. But if for some reason the algorithm gods brought you to this episode and this is your first time here listening or watching, welcome. I hope you enjoy it. And possibly by the end of it, you feel compelled enough to go back and check out the first episode and stick around for future ones. But before diving into the first topic today, just a reminder, we have no advertisers of the show so far. Still new to the screaming into the void thing on the internet. So any proceeds from sales on the website directly support the content I put out. I am working on my first run of shirts and I'm playing around with the design. Once I have a few regular listeners, I'll be posting polls on Twitter and Instagram to get community input on what looks best. Speaking of Twitter, actually, to get the show started, we'll be leading into the first topic with our very first tweet as we discuss. So, without further ado, Elon Musk. Are there plans to make the platform more user friendly as it relates to full length videos? Everyone interested in mental/physical health, science, and freedom needs an alternative to YouTube that is not censorship hell. And then I went on and I replied, I'll quit my 9 to 5 to help with this if it is indeed the path forward and you need bodies to assist. So, by now, if you haven't already guessed, our first topic today is censorship. Now, obviously, by the time this episode is posted, this tweet will be a few days old, but please like, retweet, and or reply if it speaks to you. Perhaps by the end of the topic, you'll feel compelled to do so. But here's why I really am hoping Twitter makes this shift. If you've even casually followed anyone on YouTube or any major social media platform for that matter who talks about guns, science, China, etc., you'll know that the platforms will strike and shadow ban accounts without warning, demonetizing them and preventing them and some of the individuals who run them from making a living. They can even go back and strike content retroactively after changing their guidelines, and that's more really a YouTube thing that impacts some of the gun tubers. But I understand that the social media companies can make whatever business decision, that they want for whatever reason that they want, and their users will respond accordingly. That's just how a free market works. And in this segment, I'm more so attacking the idea of censorship and less so the actual companies. However, as we've always speculated, and we now know via the Twitter files as well as many other publicly available reports, it has to be said that these companies may as well be government owned or state affiliated media, as Elon puts it. Hold that, NPR. We have seen that these companies will instantly carry out the bidding of the Democrat Party, the Republican Party, and the military and pharmaceutical industrial complexes without hesitation. And to absolutely no one's surprise, all of their demands are calls to censor individuals they do not agree with. Now, even though it is mainly government employees making demands to censor content, these social media companies and the people who run them are indeed responsible for carrying out the bidding of tyrants, no matter how hard or how harsh the punishment will be for not complying. And we're going to get a little spicy here, but history does not carve out a special place for those that are complicit in morally corrupt acts, even if they disagree with the ideology. And thinking back to when you learned about the Holocaust in school, I'm guessing the Nazis were rightfully painted with a broad brush. And ironically enough, censorship via book burnings, along with disarming those they sought to exterminate, were some of the very first steps they took to carry out their quite literally retarded ideology. So think about that shit, Zuck and Pache. Now, reeling it back in, because we almost went down a pretty dark rabbit hole there, censorship is one of the very few things in this world where you can use the word always, in that it is universally always bad. Nothing should ever be censored so that people can see and be exposed to all of the information available, enabling everyone to form an opinion on something that is well formed because they can see every side and all of the facts associated with a given topic. Now, this, of course, brings forth some uncomfortable situations, which are things that our little monkey minds struggle with. And this is calling back to Pillar 4, beware the frailty of man. And an example that is very much in the public eye today, which is probably going to raise some eyebrows here that I'm going to use, is the intermingling of drag queens and children. Now, this is a topic that honestly deserves its own segment, but here I will simply focus on censorship and freedom as it applies to it. And being somebody who believes that censorship is wholly bad, I believe that drag queens should be able to read and perform for whoever wants to enjoy that kind of entertainment. Freedom applies equally to everyone, after all, and like we touched on in the first episode, because they were born human, they possess the same natural rights as everyone else. Now, their and politicians' reasons for wanting so desperately to perform for children deserves attention, and those questions should be kept at the surface just as much as their reading abilities. However, primary driver of tension in this particular example, I believe, is that it is being pushed as part of the curriculum at schools. It's being done without parents' consent, and or is being pushed as something you accept because our representative said so. In other words, it's being forced down the throats, pun intended, of those who do not agree with it. Now, if clubs wish to host their own events for this, completely optional and devoid of government endorsement, then have at it. People can freely make the choice to take or not take their kids, and ultimately, if there is a demand for it and it turns out to be good for children and society, it will succeed. So, I guess, in other words, let the free market do its thing. And again, this topic deserves its own segment to avoid egregious oversimplification. I'm simply using it as an example where one might find themselves asking for censorship because they do not agree with something. I do not endorse subjecting a developing mind to any of this. I'm simply planting my flag on the side of absolute freedom. And in this case, that happens to be where censorship does not exist because people are completely free to make their own choices without authoritative figures forcing their ideology on those who depend on them. So that was a bit of a tangent, bit of a ramble on, long example. But now back to the topic at hand. Censorship will always be carried out with bias. And that's because humans are involved. And again, we're channeling pillar number 4 here. But whether it's an actual person watching videos and striking them, or if it's carried out by a program or AI now, because that's a hot topic, censorship will always have a lean and it will seek to remove one side of a particular topic. In the scenario of a human carrying out censorship, even if that particular human does not have biases of their own, They'd be hired by someone or a company with biases who would require them to apply said biases when doing their job. And in the case of an algorithm or AI, either would have been built by humans with biases, and so the code they run on would reflect said biases. Now, it may be a marginal decrease given that communicating digitally is not how to meaningfully interact. Shout out Joe Rogan. But without one side of the spectrum being suppressed or another being amplified, there's no need to compete for exposure of a given side's message. Plus, with all the facts available to everyone, it would be reasonable to assume that it would be much easier to come to similar conclusions. And finally, there'd be less animosity, as there wouldn't be a haves versus have nots dynamic, where one side feels as though they are perpetually suppressed, and the other side feels that they need to remain on top and that the pores should not be allowed the same privileges. So, the best example I can think of this would be the political right crying out that their content is censored, while the left is able to post their ideas as they wish, and that's all thanks to the liberal big tech companies. But the joke here is that both sides have had their requests to have content censored granted without pushback. And if the Twitter files weren't enough for you to prove that, the hatred of guns, excuse me, across all platforms proves this. And while you might say, logically, and you might push back and say that, that hatred of guns really only lines up with leftist, ideals, you're right. But the political right can just as easily demand that this type of content be permitted and threaten the social media companies' longevity. Um, but I digress. When considering that censorship is always going to be carried out with a bias and tying that in with this channel's focus, within the last 5 years or so, gun culture has grown quickly and with intent. The generation that grew up on Call of Duty, myself included, is now old enough to lawfully, it has been old enough to lawfully own guns. And that same generation being on social media follows accounts that promote their right to own firearms. And in the wake of the events of the last 3 years, they are taking their ownership of firearms and protecting what freedoms they have left very seriously. They buy optics and lights for their weapons, they invest in their kit, they train, and they adopt healthy mental and physical lifestyles, focusing on being the best man or woman they can be for themselves, their families, and their communities. This is excellent to see. However, what is concerning is there aren't many places left where you can find the sort of content offered by Garand Thumb, PSR, T Rex Arms, etc. And this is due to censorship efforts. In fact, simply because I have posted pictures of firearms on Instagram, they will not display my account. And that's not just the offending posts, but my entire account on the Explore or Discover pages. So, why does this matter? Well, because of the media these kids had access to, the current practitioners of gun culture have a very real chance of being our next patriot or warrior class, if you will. Men and women who take theirs and their families' health, safety, and freedom seriously. And this is critical now because as we've seen newer generations come, or grow up, they're becoming weaker mentally and physically, less accountable, and lazier. And it isn't too much of a stretch to believe that the platforms that these kids spend their days and nights on play a major role in this decline as they promote dancing teens and political propaganda over content supporting healthy lifestyle choices. But being an individual who is accountable for themselves and their community would naturally bring a tremendous sense of purpose, excuse me. It is also a solid starting point to avoid the shortcomings seen in younger generations today. That is what being an American, a man, a woman, a husband, a wife, a warrior, a patriot, etc., is all about at the end of the day. And yes, being able to protect what you love is a requirement, but without accountability and responsibility, you do not qualify. And yes, like when you look back at the Romans, the Spartans, the Stoics, and whatnot, they were fierce warriors, but they were smart men. They were responsible and accountable men. And that's what really being a patriot, being a warrior is about. It's not being a shoot 'em up violent individual. It's being that community man, that community woman, that figure, that family figure that really maintains the proper morals, the proper characteristics of a leader, and takes care of their own and their community first. Now, tying together censorship with blatant government overreach, we have seen increasingly harmful gun control legislation passed. From Trump's bump stock ban to the ATF brace ruling to the state of Washington's latest piece of legislation, which makes politicians' hilarious definition of an assault weapon illegal, to the latest bill that was signed into law in Vermont banning any training that simulates military tactics, and the list grows each day. If you look to America's hat, you will see where we are heading and how a tyrannical dystopian state, according to Tolstoy, is formed. Canada slowly chipped away at gun rights until there was nothing left. Not only are hunting rifles illegal, but it has been illegal to own a replica gun that shoots nothing since the 90s. And the only people who can own guns are agents of the state. And now Tolstoy proposed that the only way a government can carry out acts of tyranny is by having a monopoly on violence. They can achieve this when only they possess the means to carry out violence. So, by being the only ones in possession of firearms, they can go about doing as they please with peace of mind, knowing nobody stands a reasonable chance to oppose them. And the best example of this, the most recent example of this, was during, well, I'm not going to say the word, but over the past 3 years. How ironic is that? I'm not going to say the word on the episode about censorship, but within the past 3 years, there was a certain event that took place, and when people spoke out about certain actions the government were taking in a negative light, they simply froze their assets or seized their assets from the banks. That was a real fucking thing. To make the connection to censorship and my previous points, in Canada, they even made airsoft illegal. Why? Well, to kill the culture, and that was actually a reason stated by a representative when asked why banning plastic toy guns is necessary. And while that sounds absurd to us, it was put in the bill effortlessly because it sure did make sense to the people making the rules. Now, do you really think Prime Minister Blackface truly represents the people of Canada? I mean, look at that ass hat. Of course not. But if a generation and those that follow grows up without guns or even exposure to them via airsoft or media, and all they know is a government like the one we have today, they will be compliant and accepting of the way things are, as they will believe that is the way things should be and how they always have been. And that is exactly why what is happening here is so dangerous. I would not be surprised to see video games, movies, or airsoft on the chopping block next, given that censorship of this topic is already being carried out without legislation. Hell, the Pentagon is involved when film studios are portraying scenes of war in movies to ensure that the messaging, weapon systems, etc., being shown are fit for public consumption in their eyes. Actually, one hypothesis I hold is there is a very good chance that if you put a weapon system in front of a kid who has never touched a real firearm, but who has played Call of Duty, Tarkov, or any other first person shooter, he could safely operate it. I don't think the same could be said for those without any exposure. So I think that's actually an interesting test I would love to see carried out. Randomly have a couple hundred people run through reloading and operating the safety of a handgun, an AR, or an AK with dummy rounds, and ask them if they own a firearm, as well as what video games they've played. And if anyone has the means to facilitate this, let me know. Myself, the Full Metal Cast, I will gladly help in any way, set it up to sponsor it, and will absolutely make it a video because I think that would be fascinating to put out there. But I'll close this topic with this. Those who say that without censorship, less than savory characters or false information will be able to garner attention are absolutely right. However, the opposite applies as well. Good people spreading facts will also have free reign to share their side of things, and the free market of ideas and thought will come to a consensus after observing how statements hold up in the real world. Excuse me. The small group of people who take more and more away from you each day cannot be the ones carrying out censorship, controlling what you aren't allowed to be exposed to. They need to respect those that they serve, and they forget that they are indeed servants. That is the only way to ensure that their actions are truly in our best interest. their job, if we must tolerate them at all. And they have no reason to respect us if they are the only ones who hold all of the means to achieve their ends. Read, your rights to information, free speech, and to defend yourself. Look to China, North Korea, Chicago, Australia, and Canada, especially over the last 3 years, and so on. The places where civilians are not allowed to take their safety and freedom into their own hands, you see the greatest atrocities committed as civilians are not allowed to protect themselves. It is also no coincidence you happen to see greater censorship efforts made and deployed by the state in these places. And I don't think it won't happen here just because it hasn't happened yet. We're on the fast track, and certain pockets are already too far gone. I'm thinking about you, West Coast. Certain pockets of the East Coast are already starting to go too, though. Again, freedoms lost may never truly be regained. And to end on a more positive note, though, the community spreading the good news, if you will, is incredibly resilient. They adapt and persist. And when YouTube strikes a video because someone screwed down a suppressor or reloaded a magazine into an AR, which are actual things that resulted in strikes for certain channels, the content creators find a way to still put out videos daily and highlight the tyranny being carried out while also making light of the situation. And this is the cultural battle that I also, mentioned in the first episode, but this is the battle that we need to be fighting, that needs to be taking place. These people didn't storm the YouTube offices. They didn't threaten people with violence. No, they continued rebelling peacefully and effectively, staying on message. And by consuming and sharing this type of media, you are also taking part in fighting the good fight. Now, it is a small part, I will admit, but any step taken toward the right side of history is always worth taking. Censorship monologue over. Cutting that one a little bit shorter because in the very first episode, I really hammered home a bit of a heavier topic. So, going to move on to our fun and palate cleansing topic in this episode. And I know you saw it in the title, and I bet you've been just dying to get to this point. But goth chicks, the meme that has taken the internet by storm and is incredibly relatable for most of us. So, in this ending topic, I'm going to try to answer why the hell that is for everyone, why I felt compelled to buy this patch, why I felt compelled to buy the shirt I wore as I started the video today, why I have 3 theories that I'm going to try to lay before you to hopefully make some sense of what's going on in our little monkey brains here. Theory number 1. I hold that counterculture is always sexy. Think about the punk/grunge music era. Those bands, those songs, the entire aesthetic was just incredibly appealing. Ripped jeans and flannel are still a vibe today, really, and there's just something about letting go of the expectations society has of us and even going against them that kind of carries a sense of relief and freedom. So, therefore, I guess the equation goes something like goth chicks equals freedom. You're welcome. Theory number 2. The pendulum theory also applies here, I believe. What was once popular and has fallen out of style will inevitably come back around to being in vogue again. So more specifically here, the MySpace emo/goth aesthetic had its moment, then faded and was memed and mocked. But just like bell bottoms, perms, synthwave, fanny packs, and Christianity, goth girls, thanks be to God, made a triumphant return. And my third and most scientific theory, if you will, as to why goth girls are so appealing to the masses is something that's called the novelty cue. Now, you can read more about this concept and more about how sexual preferences differ in males and females in the book A Billion Wicked Thoughts, which I highly recommend, by the way, definitely in my top 10 list of books. But in short, the novelty cue in men causes us to constantly seek out new and exciting sexual horizons. So, this also explains why you might find yourself on one hell of a strange corner of the internet when perusing for adult content. Similarly, goth girls are on one extreme end of a spectrum of females, I suppose, and this excites us. So, just like the forbidden fruit, we cannot look away and we simply must have a taste. Taking these 3 theories, I have formed a hypothesis that just might explain why we are so weak to goth girls that incorporates freedom, nirvana, fanny packs, and Christianity. Hope you learned something here today. Before closing out this video, I mentioned it in episode 1, but I asked everyone to send in any sort of questions they want answered in the Q&A. I only got 2, and they were friends who know I'm kind of doing this thing. But they were good questions, so I'm going to answer them. I'm going to answer the most simple one first because the other one is just absurd, quite frankly, but it's a bit of a running joke in the group. The first is, do I have a drink of choice right now? And honestly, that's a tough question. I'm a bourbon nut more than anything. If I need to sit back and relax and just sort of wind down, I'm going to pour myself a, 2-finger pour of neat, nice, usually barrel proof bourbon, the 100+ proof stuff. Uh, I guess you can call me a bit of a snob now when it comes to bourbons and to whiskeys. I've gone on the bourbon trail. I've tasted many bourbons, learned how to taste them properly. My palate is, always developing, always growing, but I feel like I am able to derive a good amount of, flavor from either, smelling, from tasting a bourbon, and I feel like I'm able to determine, what a good bourbon is and, what I like really. If I had to narrow down what my favorite bourbon is right now, though, that would be incredibly tough. Um, just trying to think what I have on my shelf right now. You know what? I think I'm gonna call it. I think I'm a fan of the Bluegrass distillery in Kentucky. And Bluegrass Distillers does a bourbon, and they're the only ones in the country, as far as I'm aware of, that make bourbon using blue corn. And it's got such a nutty, sort of corny flavor to it that I like that one so much because one, it's very unique to me. It's very strong. I think the barrel proof is like 122.5 proof. But I like it because if I need to teach somebody or walk somebody through a tasting and how to really pick out flavors and sort of make those connections in their brain, that's the go-to one because they can pick out that corn, that sort of nutty flavor instantly. So that's my favorite. It's very interesting, very unique. If I had to go for a more basic answer, weather's getting nicer, it's getting warmer. I love a Dos Equis. Love a Mexican beer, but Dos Equis is my favorite. Dos Equis Especial with a lime. Ooh, right on the patio, it's perfect. It's just the most refreshing drink during the summertime, and we're in the summertime now, baby. And the second question, you're gonna have to bear with me here because it's gonna get a little weird, but it's called the orangutan ultimatum. And the first time I heard it and why I even thought to ask my friends this was I watch the Coney stream sometimes on YouTube, and Coney, mostly a video game YouTuber. He used to do some gaming commentary regarding, Smash Bros. And other fighting games, but really mostly a Smash Bros. Commentator. He played in some tournaments as well, but mostly a gaming channel. I watch it for fun sometimes when I'm, laying in bed or snacking or eating dinner. And it came up just randomly during an episode, but essentially, the orangutan ultimatum goes like this. You have two choices. Option number one is every time you get into your car and you have to go somewhere, when you start your car, a goblin appears. And before you can carry on with your commute or your travels, you have to dispatch the goblin. Option one. Option two is once a year at a random time, an orangutan wielding a two-handed claymore greatsword spawns in randomly in the world. It may be next to you, it may be on the other side of the world, but it has the ability to know where you are at all times, and it will consistently try to track you down and kill you, and you must try to kill it. Now, some details I've been able to sort of gather around both scenarios. For the first scenario, the goblin, it's smaller, maybe no taller than 2 feet. It spawns anywhere randomly in your car. It wields no weapons. It's incredibly weak. You know, 3, 4, 5 punches, do the trick and poof, it disappears. No mess in the car. The orangutan, however, constantly is able to track you down, can spawn in at any time, anywhere. When it does spawn in, an audio cue will play. Unsure if that means it's boss music or you'll just hear, a Dark Souls sort of invasion sound playing. Um, but, you have to consider that you could be on a plane and maybe if you have a shit roll, it spawns in on the plane. Or maybe right before the clock strikes midnight on December 31st, you hear the audio cue, and across the bar, you see the orangutan spawn in holding that sword, and you're going, oh shit, maybe you kill it there. But then as soon as Jan 1st hits, it plays again, and guess what you're doing? Got to kick off the new year. The whole thing's kind of fucked. But, anyways, I'm going with the orangutan on this, and bear with me. Obviously, there's no secret I have the guntism, so that's obviously going for me. But it's also a one and done thing in the year, so like no biggie. It's one time. I at least use my car twice a day for the most part, going to and from work. And that's not counting the gym because I'll go to work, then to the gym, then from gym to home. So sometimes that's going to be, you know, two, three, four times a day. If I got to get groceries, maybe I got to get gas too. And also, let's think about this. Let's say you're taking someone on a first date and you got to sit them down, mentally prepare them when you start that car to be like, hey, listen, I'm going to turn this key and something's going to go down and you might see some things. I just don't really want to deal with that. So I'm going with the orangutan, me versus the big orange monkey. What was the Donkey Kong character? I should know this. I am the biggest Donkey Kong fan in the world. Donkey Kong is probably my favorite video game character of all time. I'll think of it. I'll put a picture up there and I'll make myself look stupid later. But yeah, I'm taking the Sekiro boss, the great ape. I'm taking the orangutan with the great sword, and we'll do combat once a year, I think. But that's it for the Q&A. Please, again, send me, DM me, email me your questions for next episode or future episodes Q&A. All of our socials are in the description below. Our email will be down there as well. If you don't have any of the socials and you feel more comfortable sending me your questions like that, you will always remain anonymous. Won't share your name, your email, your social media accounts. But that's it. Thanks for sticking around and tuning in to the second episode of the Full Metal Cast. Again, like I said, you can find us on Instagram, Twitter. You can find us and all of our episodes on YouTube, Spotify, so long as you don't take them down, and our website. The links to all of those again in the description. Please, if you enjoyed the content, give this a like, a follow, and or subscribe on the platforms mentioned if you haven't already, and share with your family and your friends as something that is just getting off the ground here. That organic sort of referral interaction is exactly what we need to help push things along. And with that, until next week, Full Metal family, best of luck finding your Goth GFs. Stay curious, stay open minded, and stay persistent in the age of censorship. But most importantly, and as always, stay metal. Thank you.